May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Church bells ring across London. American soldiers dance in the streets of Paris. The Nazi regime is dead. The war, the bloodiest in human history, is finally over. But in a cramped office in Moscow, a Soviet intelligence officer named Pavel Sudoplatov is not celebrating. He's reading a report that will change everything. A report about a weapon so powerful, it could vaporize an entire city in seconds. And the Americans are building it in secret. In a basement archive in Berlin, American Captain Robert Murphy discovers something the world was never meant to see. Nazi files on the Soviet Union's secret plans for Eastern Europe. Plans drawn up while they were still supposed to be allies. And in a frozen prisoner of war camp in Siberia, a German soldier named Heinrich Schuster writes a letter to his wife. It's 1945. The war is over. But he won't see home for another 10 years. Because for him, and for millions like him, the war never ended. This is the story you weren't taught in school. The missing pages of 1945. The year World War II became the Cold War. And nobody fired a single shot to start it. April 25, 1945. The Elbe River, Germany. American and Soviet troops meet for the first time. They embrace. They drink together. They pose for photographs that will be printed in newspapers around the world. The image is perfect, the Grand Alliance, victorious, united. But 3 days earlier, something else happened. Something the cameras didn't capture. Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko of the Soviet Army's NKVD, the secret police, received orders directly from Moscow. The orders were explicit: identify German scientists, engineers, and technicians before the Americans do. Secure them. Move them east. By force if necessary. The same time, Major Robert Staver of U.S. Army Ordnance received nearly identical orders. Find the German rocket scientists. Get them before the Soviets. America's future depends on it. The race was on. And neither side told the other. Let me take you to Peenemünde, on Germany's Baltic coast. This is where the V-2 rocket was born. The world's first long-range ballistic missile. It could travel 200 miles. Reach speeds of 3,500 miles per hour. And there was no defense against it. April 1945, this facility is a prize worth more than gold. Because whoever controls these scientists controls the future of warfare. And possibly, the future of space itself. Wernher von Braun. Remember that name. He's 33 years old. Brilliant. Ambitious. And yes, a former member of the Nazi Party and the SS. He directed the V-2 program that killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. He used slave labor from concentration camps to build his rockets. Prisoners died by the thousands in the underground factories. But von Braun knows something crucial. The war is ending, and he needs to choose a side. On May 2, 1945, von Braun and his team surrender to American forces. Not the Soviets. He made his choice. Years later, in a declassified interview, he explained why. We knew that the Americans would treat us better. We'd heard what happened to Germans the Soviets captured. He was right to be afraid. Within weeks, the United States launches Operation Paperclip. The name comes from the paperclips used to attach new security clearances to the files of former Nazi scientists. The program's goal: bring 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America. Give them new identities. Erase their Nazi past. Put them to work. The justification? If we don't take them, the Soviets will. And the Soviets were thinking exactly the same thing. By June 1945, Soviet intelligence teams have fanned out across occupied Germany. They're not just looking for scientists. They're seizing entire factories. Railroad cars full of equipment disappear eastward in the night. Machine tools. Documents. Blueprints. People. In one documented case, Soviet forces surrounded an entire German rocket facility, loaded everyone, scientists, secretaries, janitors, onto trains, and shipped them to the Soviet Union. Their families too. No choice. No paperwork. They simply vanished. This is the moment. May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but a new kind of conflict has already begun. Not fought with armies. Fought with secrets, scientists, and stolen technology. And it's about to get worse. Let me tell you about Heinrich Schuster. He was 24 years old in 1945. A Wehrmacht soldier captured by Soviet forces during the Battle of Berlin. He survived the battle. That was the easy part. On May 9, 1945, the day after victory in Europe, Heinrich is marched to a temporary holding camp. He expects to be processed and sent home within weeks, maybe months. That's what international law requires. The Geneva Convention is clear. Prisoners must be repatriated promptly after hostilities end. But Heinrich Schuster won't see Germany again until 1955. 10 years. He was not alone. According to recently declassified Soviet archives, approximately 2.8 million German prisoners of war were held in the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Most were eventually released by 1950. But hundreds of thousands were not. They were reclassified. No longer prisoners of war. Now they were convicted war criminals. Or retained specialists. Or simply, they disappeared from the records entirely. The camps didn't close. They were repurposed. In Heinrich's case, he was sent to Camp 75-25-12 in the Ural Mountains. A labor camp. He worked in a timber operation, cutting wood in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. He received 400 grams of bread per day, watery soup, and letters from home that had been opened, read, and sometimes never delivered at all. His wife, Anna, wrote to him every week. She wrote to the Red Cross. She wrote to the Soviet embassy. She wrote to the West German government after it was established in 1949. 4 years, she received the same response. No information available. In 1947, the Soviet Union officially stated that all German POWs had been repatriated. This was a lie. And the world knew it was a lie. But what could anyone do? Let me read you something. This is a letter Heinrich managed to smuggle out in 1949, 4 years after the war ended. It was discovered in KGB archives in the 1990s. Anna, if you receive this, know that I am alive. They tell us we will go home when we have paid our debt to the Soviet people. But I do not know what debt I owe that takes 10 years of my life. I think of you every day. I think of Greta, that's their daughter, who must be 8 years old now. Does she remember me? Tell her I am coming home. I must believe this. I must. He did make it home. 1955. Part of a prisoner exchange negotiated by West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. When Heinrich stepped off the train in Frankfurt, his wife almost didn't recognize him. He'd aged 20 years in 10. His daughter, Greta, was 13. She had no memory of him. Thousands of other German POWs never came home. They died in the camps. Starvation, disease, cold, accidents in the mines and forests where they worked. The exact number will never be known because the records were destroyed or remain classified. But here's what matters for our story. This wasn't about revenge. It was about power. The Soviet Union was devastated. 27 million dead. Cities reduced to rubble. Factories destroyed. They needed labor to rebuild. German POWs provided that labor. Free labor. And there was another reason. A strategic one. By holding German prisoners, Stalin gained leverage. He could trade them. He could extract concessions from the West. And he could send a message: we won. We decide when this war is truly over. Meanwhile, in the West, the United States and Britain faced a dilemma. They held thousands of Soviet citizens, displaced persons, former POWs, forced laborers, who desperately did not want to return to the Soviet Union. Stalin demanded their return. The Yalta Agreement seemed to require it. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in post-war history. It's called Operation Keelhaul. Between 1945 and 1947, Western allies forcibly repatriated approximately 2 million Soviet citizens to the USSR. Many begged not to be sent back. Some attempted suicide rather than return. They knew what awaited them. Stalin considered anyone who had been captured by the Germans to be a traitor. Contaminated by the West. Dangerous. Upon their return, many were sent directly to the Gulag. Others were executed. A British officer who participated in one of these forced repatriations later wrote, "We were ordered to use whatever force necessary. They knew they were being sent to their deaths. We knew it too. I have never forgiven myself." This is the missing page. The part of 1945 that gets left out of the celebrations and the newsreels. While the public saw parades and victory gardens, behind the scenes, the great powers were already maneuvering, manipulating, sacrificing individuals for geopolitical advantage. The Cold War didn't start with the Berlin airlift in 1948, or the Korean War in 1950. It started here, in the camps, in the forced returns, in the secret calculations about who mattered and who didn't, and it was about to get even colder. July 16, 1945. 5:29 a.m. Alamogordo, New Mexico. The world's first atomic bomb detonates in the desert. Code name, Trinity. The flash is visible 200 miles away. The explosion creates a crater 1,100 feet wide. Temperatures at ground zero reach 14,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, watches through dark goggles. Later, he'll famously recall a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But there's something else he doesn't know yet. Something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The Soviets already know about the bomb. Let me introduce you to Klaus Fuchs. Born in Germany, 1911. A brilliant physicist. A committed communist. A refugee from Nazi persecution. The British welcomed him, trusted him, and in 1943, sent him to Los Alamos as part of the British delegation to the Manhattan Project. He had access to everything. Bomb designs, uranium enrichment techniques, yield calculations, and he passed it all to the Soviet Union. According to KGB archives declassified in the 1990s, Fuchs met with his Soviet handler, Harry Gold, at least 7 times between 1944 and 1945. He gave them blueprints, mathematical formulas, detailed technical drawings of the Fat Man plutonium implosion bomb. The information was so valuable that Soviet physicists later said it advanced their program by at least 2 years. Maybe more. On August 6, 1945, the United States drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 70,000 people die instantly. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another 40,000 dead immediately. Japan surrenders on August 15. World War II is over. President Harry Truman believes America has a monopoly on atomic weapons. He believes this gives the United States unprecedented leverage in shaping the post-war world. He's wrong. In Moscow, Stalin is informed of Hiroshima within hours. His response, according to his foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov, is calm, almost indifferent. "We'll have to have a talk with Kurchatov," Stalin says, referring to Igor Kurchatov, head of the Soviet atomic program, "and speed things up." Stalin already knew the bomb was coming. Thanks to Fuchs and other Soviet spies in the Manhattan Project, including Theodore Hall, David Greenglass, and others, Soviet intelligence had been receiving detailed reports for years. But there's a deeper story here. A human story that reveals exactly how the Cold War mentality was born. Let me tell you about the moment everything changed. July 24, 1945. Potsdam, Germany. The Big Three, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, are meeting to decide the fate of post-war Europe. During a break in the conference, Truman approaches Stalin. He mentions casually that the United States has developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin's response? He simply nods. Says he hopes America will make good use of it against Japan. That's it. No questions. No surprise. Truman is confused. He expected shock. Maybe fear. Maybe anger. Instead, Stalin seems almost disinterested. What Truman didn't know, Stalin had already received a full intelligence report on the Trinity test before Truman even arrived in Potsdam. After the meeting, Stalin immediately cables Kurchatov in Moscow, "Hurry with the job." The Soviet atomic bomb project shifts into maximum overdrive. Nothing else matters. This is the moment the nuclear arms race begins. Right here. Not with missiles or bombers. With a lie and a secret. And here's the tragedy. Klaus Fuchs genuinely believed he was preventing war. In his confession to British intelligence in 1950, he explained his reasoning. "I had complete confidence in Russian policy. I felt that the Western Allies deliberately allowed Germany and Russia to fight each other to the death. I believed that knowledge of the atomic bomb would keep the peace because a balance of power would be maintained." He was a true believer. A man who thought he was saving the world by ensuring both sides had the ultimate weapon. The logic of deterrence. Mutually assured destruction. But what he actually did was guarantee that the next 45 years would be lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. By 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning. American intelligence estimates had predicted the Soviets wouldn't achieve this until the mid-1950s at the earliest. They were off by 6 years. The American monopoly lasted exactly 4 years. And the entire strategic foundation of U.S. foreign policy collapsed overnight. In early 1950, Klaus Fuchs confesses. He's arrested in Britain, tried, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He serves 9 years and is released in 1959. He moves to East Germany, where he continues his career as a physicist until his death in 1988. He never expressed regret. The other spies, some were caught, some were never identified. The Venona Project, a secret U.S. program that decrypted Soviet intelligence communications, revealed dozens of codenames for Soviet assets within the Manhattan Project. Many were never conclusively identified. To this day, there are likely spies whose names we'll never know. Think about that. The most important military secret in human history, the atomic bomb, was compromised from the very beginning. Not by a failure of security, but by ideology. By true believers who thought they were serving a higher cause. This is how the Cold War begins. Not with armies facing each other across borders, but with secrets. With spies embedded so deep that they shape the very weapons that define the age. And while scientists betrayed their countries in the name of peace, diplomats were about to betray entire nations in the name of power. February 1945. The Levadia Palace, Yalta, Crimea. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meet to decide what the world will look like after Hitler's defeat. The war isn't even over yet, but they're already dividing the spoils. The official story you learned in school, the Big Three agreed to establish the United Nations, demand unconditional surrender from Germany, and hold free elections in liberated countries. The real story is more complicated. Much more complicated. Let me show you what was actually negotiated at Yalta, and what it meant for millions of people. Poland. Stalin insists that Poland's eastern border be moved west, annexing almost half of pre-war Poland into the Soviet Union. In compensation, Poland's western border would be moved into Germany. The result, Poland shifts westward like a piece on a chessboard. Millions of people, Poles, Germans, Ukrainians, find themselves on the wrong side of new borders overnight. Stalin promises free and unfettered elections in Poland. Roosevelt and Churchill believe him, or at least pretend to. Within 2 years, Poland will be a communist dictatorship, and there will be no free elections for the next 44 years. Eastern Europe. The phrase that appears in the Yalta Agreement is deliberately vague, spheres of influence. Stalin understands this to mean the Soviet Union has a free hand in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt believes it means the Soviets will allow democracy, just with friendly governments. This misunderstanding, or willful self-deception, will cost millions of people their freedom. Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "The only bond of the victors is their common hate. It is a bond of fear." What will happen when that fear is removed? He knew. Even then, he knew. Within months, the Red Army occupies Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the eastern half of Germany. Soviet-backed communist parties begin to take control. Opposition politicians are arrested, exiled, or simply disappear. The press is censored. Secret police forces are established, often trained and supervised by the NKVD. In Poland, the Home Army, the underground resistance force that fought the Nazis throughout the occupation, is betrayed by their supposed Soviet liberators. Stalin considers them a threat. By 1947, thousands of Home Army veterans have been arrested and deported to Siberia. Many will die there. In Romania, King Michael is forced to abdicate at gunpoint in 1947. In Czechoslovakia, Jan Masaryk, the foreign minister and son of the country's founder, supposedly commits suicide by jumping from a window in 1948. Nobody believes it was suicide. In Hungary, democratic politicians are arrested on fabricated charges and forced to confess in show trials. This is the Iron Curtain descending. Not all at once. Slowly. Methodically. One country at a time. And the Western Allies watch. They protest. They issue statements. But they do nothing. Why? Because at Yalta, and later at Potsdam in July 1945, the United States and Britain made a calculated decision. They needed Soviet help to finish the war against Japan. They needed Soviet cooperation for the United Nations. And frankly, there was no appetite in America or Britain for another war. Not after 6 years of total war. Not after millions of deaths. So they let Stalin have Eastern Europe. The people living there had no say in this decision. They were simply assigned to one empire or another. Let me tell you about one specific case. One person. Because statistics become meaningful only when you see the human being behind them. His name was Jan Karski, a Polish resistance fighter. In 1942, he infiltrated the Warsaw Ghetto and a Nazi transit camp to witness the Holocaust firsthand. Then he escaped occupied Europe and brought his eyewitness testimony to the West. He met with Churchill. He met with Roosevelt. He begged them to do something to stop the genocide. They thanked him for the information. Then they did nothing. In 1945, Karski watched as Poland, the country he'd risked everything to save, was handed over to Stalin. The people he'd fought beside in the resistance were arrested by Soviet forces. Some were executed. Others were sent to gulags. Karski never returned to Poland. He became an American citizen and taught at Georgetown University for 40 years. In interviews later in life, he was asked if he felt betrayed by the Western Allies. His answer, betrayed? No. I understood the realities of power. But I will say this, we fought for freedom. And we were given a different master. That is the truth of 1945. By 1946, Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, delivers a speech in Fulton, Missouri. The speech that names the thing everyone already knows. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence but to a very high and, in many cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow. The Iron Curtain. The phrase captures the imagination of the world. But it's not a metaphor. It's a physical reality. Barbed wire. Guard towers. Minefields. Soldiers with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. The division of Europe is complete. And it will last for 44 years. But how did it happen? How did two allies, who fought together against fascism, become enemies so quickly? The answer is, they were never really allies. They were partners of convenience. And the moment the common enemy was defeated, the partnership dissolved. Because the ideologies were fundamentally incompatible. Soviet communism, a vision of a world remade through revolutionary transformation, where the state controls all. American capitalism, a vision of a world organized around free markets and individual liberty. These two visions cannot coexist peacefully. One must win, or both must accept a permanent, armed standoff. In 1945, nobody knew which it would be. They only knew that the world would never be the same. There were people who understood what was happening. Even before most people realized the war with Germany was ending, they were already warning about the war to come. Let me tell you about three of them. George Kennan, a mid-level American diplomat stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He'd lived in the Soviet Union on and off since the 1930s. He spoke Russian. He understood the ideology, the history, the paranoia that drove Soviet decision-making. In February 1946, the U.S. State Department sent a routine cable to Moscow asking for analysis of Soviet intentions. Kennan's response was anything but routine. He wrote what became known as the Long Telegram, 8,000 words analyzing Soviet ideology and predicting exactly how the Cold War would unfold. He argued that Soviet leaders viewed the world as inherently hostile and believed that capitalism and communism could not coexist. Therefore, the Soviet Union would seek to expand its influence wherever possible, not out of security concerns, but out of ideological necessity. His recommendation: containment. Don't try to roll back Soviet power. Don't start a war. But don't let them expand further. Draw a line. Hold it. Wait for the internal contradictions of communism to cause the system to collapse from within. This telegram became the foundation of U.S. Cold War strategy for the next 40 years. Kennan was right about many things. But he later regretted what his ideas became. He advocated for political and economic containment. What America built was military containment, bases circling the globe, nuclear weapons, proxy wars. In his later years, Kennan said the Cold War had taken on a life of its own, beyond anything he'd intended. Now let me tell you about someone on the other side. Milovan Djilas, a Yugoslav communist, a partisan fighter during World War II, a true believer in the revolution. He met with Stalin multiple times during and after the war, and he became disillusioned. In 1945, Djilas witnessed the Red Army's behavior in Yugoslavia and Eastern Europe. The looting, the rapes, the brutality. He raised concerns with Soviet commanders. He was told, "Our soldiers have fought across thousands of kilometers. They deserve some spoils." He saw how Stalin treated smaller communist nations, not as partners, but as subjects. When Yugoslavia's leader, Josip Broz Tito, tried to pursue an independent path, Stalin attempted to have him assassinated. Multiple times. Djilas broke with the Soviet Union. In 1957, he published The New Class, a devastating critique of communist bureaucracy. He argued that communism had simply replaced one ruling class with another, the party elite. That it was a system of oppression wearing the mask of liberation. He was imprisoned for his views. But his book was smuggled out and became a sensation in the West. It confirmed what many suspected: the Soviet system was corrupt, oppressive, and ultimately unsustainable. Two men. One American, one Yugoslav. Both communists in their own way. Kennan an intellectual observer, Djilas a true believer. Both came to the same conclusion: this system cannot last. But there's a third person I want you to know about. Someone who saw it from the inside and paid the ultimate price. Raoul Wallenberg. A Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust by issuing them protective passports. A hero by any measure. In January 1945, Soviet forces liberate Budapest. Wallenberg goes to meet them, expecting to be treated as an ally. Instead, he's arrested. The charge: suspected espionage. He disappears into the Soviet prison system. 4 years, the Swedish government demands answers. The Soviets claim he died in 1947 of a heart attack. but witnesses report seeing him alive in Soviet prisons in the 1950s, even the 1960s. Why was he arrested? Probably because he'd seen too much. He had contacts in the West. He'd operated independently. He was a potential source of information, or a potential liability. In Stalin's world, that was enough. Raoul Wallenberg's fate is still officially unresolved. The Soviets never admitted what really happened. His family never got closure. This is what the Cold War meant in human terms. People disappeared. Questions went unanswered. And the powerful did whatever they wanted, because there was no higher authority to stop them. By 1947, the lines were drawn. The Marshall Plan, America's massive economic aid program, would rebuild Western Europe. The Soviets would reject it and establish their own economic bloc in the East. In 1948, the Berlin blockade. The Soviets cut off all land access to West Berlin, trying to starve it into submission. The West responds with the Berlin airlift, flying in supplies for 11 months until Stalin backs down. In 1949, NATO is established. A military alliance explicitly designed to counter Soviet power. In 1949, the Soviets test their atomic bomb. In 1950, the Korean War begins. The first hot war of the Cold War. But all of it, was set in motion in 1945. In the missing pages, the secret deals, the betrayals, the calculations, the moment when World War II ended and the Cold War began. Here's the final truth. There was no single moment when the Cold War started. No dramatic event. No declaration. It emerged gradually from the ashes of World War II, built on mutual suspicion, ideological hatred, and the naked pursuit of power. The people who suffered most weren't the leaders who made these decisions. They weren't the diplomats or the generals. They were the millions of ordinary people caught in between. The German POWs who rotted in Soviet camps. The Soviet citizens forcibly returned to face execution. The Eastern Europeans who thought they were being liberated, only to find themselves under new occupation. The refugees, the displaced, the forgotten. In 1945, the world celebrated victory. And it was a victory. Fascism had been defeated. Evil had been beaten back. But another darkness was rising. One that would define the next half-century. Heinrich Schuster, the German POW we met at the beginning, made it home in 1955. But he never fully recovered. He had nightmares for the rest of his life. He barely spoke about his years in captivity. When he died in 1987, his daughter found a box of letters hidden in his attic. Letters he'd written to his wife but never sent. Letters describing the cold, the hunger, the hopelessness. The last letter, dated 1954, said simply, "I don't know if I'll survive to see home. But if I do, tell everyone what happened. Don't let them forget. Don't let them say it was all necessary. Some things are never necessary." That's the missing page. The human cost of geopolitical strategy. The individual lives crushed beneath the weight of empires. And here's what we need to understand. The Cold War didn't have to happen the way it did. Different choices could have been made. Trust could have been built. Compromises could have been reached. But they weren't. Because power, once tasted, is almost impossible to relinquish. And fear, once planted, grows like a weed. The year 1945 was a turning point. Not just the end of one war, but the beginning of another. A war that wouldn't be fought with armies and invasions, but with spies and secrets, proxy conflicts and nuclear threats. A war that would bring humanity to the brink of extinction multiple times. A war that would only end when the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. But that's a story for another time. This is the story of how it began. In the missing pages of 1945. In the camps, the laboratories, the conference rooms where the powerful decided the fate of millions. This is how World War II became the Cold War. And nobody fired a shot.